Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down a book that honestly flipped a lot of people's ideas about money completely upside down. Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. The whole thing really boils down to this one powerful question. What if everything your parents told you about getting rich was just plain wrong? So let's dive in. So, the whole book is built on this really fascinating premise. See, the author, Robert Kiyosaki, he basically grew up with two dads. You had his actual father, who he calls Poor Dad, and then his best friend's father, who he calls Rich Dad. And let me tell you, their advice on money could not have been more different. It was like they were from two different planets, and it really set him at this crucial crossroads from a super young age. So, let's talk about these two dads, these two very different paths. On one side, you've got Poor Dad. This guy was brilliant, a highly educated school superintendent, had a PhD and everything. And then you've got Rich Dad, an eighth-grade dropout who ended up a self-made millionaire. I mean, the contrast is just incredible, right? Yeah, and their mindsets were just polar opposites. It was wild. Poor Dad would say things like, the love of money is the root of all evil. But Rich Dad, he'd fire back, no, the lack of money is the root of all evil. And here's the real kicker. When they saw something they wanted but couldn't buy, Poor Dad's response was always, I can't afford it, end of story. But for Rich Dad, that was just the beginning. His question was always, okay, how can I afford it? See the difference? One's a statement that closes your mind, the other is a question that opens it up. And being caught between these two, a young Robert had to constantly think, compare, and, figure out which path he was going to take. This brings us to where the story really gets going, this idea of being trapped in the rat race. It all started when Robert was just 9 years old. He got tired of being called the poor kid, so he goes straight to his rich dad and asks him point blank, can you teach me how to make money? And that question, well, it led to his first job offer, and it was a weird one. So, what was the big offer? Rich Dad told him he could work in one of his convenience stores dusting cans. Yep, dusting cans. And the pay? A whopping 10 cents an hour. Now look, I know this was the 1950s, but even then, for a 9-year-old kid, that's next to nothing. We're talking basically slave labor here. So, as you can imagine, after a few weeks of this super boring, mind-numbing work for literal pennies, Robert and his friend Mike had had enough. They were angry, they felt exploited, and they marched right in to quit. And right then, Rich Dad just smiles. This was the moment he was waiting for. He told them, look, life is your greatest teacher, and sometimes it pushes you around to teach you something important. And here it is, the first huge lesson from Rich Dad. He says the poor and the middle class work for money. The rich have money work for them. He explained that most people's lives are controlled by two things, fear and desire. It's the fear of not having money that gets you out of bed into a job you might not even like. Then, once you get that paycheck, desire kicks in. You see a new gadget, a nicer car, and you spend it. Get up, go to work, pay bills, repeat. That whole cycle, that's what he called the rat race. So how do you break that cycle? Well, Rich Dad's next lesson was a real curveball. It was a total shocker. He looked at the boys and said, okay, I want you to keep working. Same hours, same boring job dusting cans, but from now on, I'm not paying you anything. That's right. Zero. Zilch. Nada. So what on earth would you do in that situation? His whole point was to get them to stop thinking about the paycheck, to get it completely out of their heads. He was forcing them to open their eyes and use their minds to see opportunities that most people miss because they're too focused on just getting paid. They weren't working for money anymore. Now they were working to learn. Okay, so now we get to the good part. How do you actually have money work for you? Well, being forced to think differently, with no paycheck to look forward to, the boys started seeing things differently. And pretty soon, they spotted their first real opportunity. So here's what they noticed. They saw the manager of the store taking old comic books, ripping off the front covers, to return to the distributor for credit, and then just throwing the rest of the comic book away. The actual comic, the stories, all just going in the trash. So they got an idea. They went to the distributor and asked if they could just have the old comics. He said, sure, as long as you promise not to resell them. So they couldn't resell them. What did they do? They created their own little business. It was actually genius. Step 1, collect all these free comic books. Step 2, they cleared out an empty room in a basement and opened a comic book library. Step 3, they charged the neighborhood kids 10 cents admission. For that dime, you got 2 hours to read as many comics as you wanted. And get this, step 4, they even hired Mike's little sister to be the librarian for $1 a week. They created a system. And it worked. Their little comic book library was bringing in an average of $9.50 a week. That's huge. And more importantly, this was their first taste of what we call passive income. The money was coming in even when they weren't there. Just think about that for a second. They went from making 30 cents for 3 hours of backbreaking work to making $9.50 a week from a business that ran itself. And that's the whole point. They weren't employees anymore. They were business owners. They had learned the biggest lesson of all, how to have money work for them. They created an asset, a little money-making machine, and that is the fundamental difference between thinking like an employee and thinking like Rich Dad. All right, so now that they'd had a taste of what it's like to be business owners, Rich Dad decided it was time to reveal the one rule of wealth, the single most important rule he said you need to know. He told them, if you can just get this one thing, you'll be set for life. And the rule? It's deceptively simple. He said, you must know the difference between an asset and a liability, and then you just buy assets. That's it. It sounds almost too easy, doesn't it? But Rich Dad was adamant that this is the main reason people struggle with money. They simply don't understand this fundamental difference. So what's an asset? Let's forget all the complicated jargon you hear from accountants. Rich Dad's definition is beautiful in its simplicity. An asset is anything that puts money in your pocket. Period. Think about a business you own, stocks that pay you dividends, or a rental property where that rent check comes in every single month. And a liability is, you guessed it, the exact opposite. A liability is anything that takes money out of your pocket. This is your mortgage payment, your car loan, student loans, credit card debt, basically anything that's constantly creating expenses and pulling cash away from you. And this is where we see your money story. I love this idea. The way cash flows into and out of your life, well, that tells the entire story of where you're headed financially. It's either a story about you acquiring assets that feed you, or a story about you piling up liabilities that you have to constantly feed. Just look at these two cash flow patterns. It makes it so clear. For the middle class, what happens? Your income from your job comes in, and it flows right back out to pay for liabilities. Your mortgage, your car loan, all that stuff. It's pretty much a one-way street. But now look at the wealthy. Their income flows from their assets. And what do they do with that money? They buy more assets, which then generate more income. It becomes this amazing, powerful, self-sustaining cycle. So here's the crucial difference, the real takeaway. It is not about how much money you make. It's about how much money you keep, and then how hard that money works for you. The rich focus on one thing, building up that asset column. The poor and middle class, they focus on their income, and they acquire liabilities that they think are assets. And that right there, that misunderstanding, is financial literacy 101. And that brings us to the final and maybe most controversial question from the book. Is your home an asset, or is it your biggest liability? It's a tough one because we're all taught our home is our greatest asset. But according to Rich Dad's definition, since it's constantly taking money out of your pocket for the mortgage, for taxes, for insurance, for repairs, it's a liability. Now that is a really provocative thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.